Atari takes Pacman clones to court. Sinclair balks at government handouts for BBC Micros. And Captain Kirk pimps the VIC-20. These stories and our celebration of 50 years of computer space on this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, the show where we have to record the intro 4 times because Carl can't keep his shit. Yes. Dear listeners, you didn't hear the previous versions of that, but oh well. So, this is the show where we go back in time to see what was making headlines in the video game and computer industries 40, 30, and 20 years ago. Today, we're going to be traveling back 40 years to find out what was making headlines in December of 1981. I'm your host, Carl, and I'm back again with one of our favorite co-hosts, Mads. Welcome back, Mads.
Thanks for having me, mate. And today we're actually traveling even further back in time, aren't we?
Oh, hey, we have one really big jump and one especially important jump. Mm-hmm. So, yes, but before we turn on the time machine, and normally at this point we would have to, do our little banter thing, but we've got too much news. So, as I said in the headlines, this month we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of computer space. And there is some debate. It may have actually shipped in November of 71, but for sure we know there were units shipping in December of 71. Mm-hmm. And so we will be talking about that today. And, of course, our dear listeners know that we do a wonderful segment called The 7 Minutes in Heaven, where the co-host has to play a game that they've never played before for 7 minutes. And in honor of the 50th anniversary of Computer Space, the first commercially available video game, we decided we were going to use this, even though Mads has actually played Computer Space.
Well, just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Well, close enough. It's still going to be worth the while. So here we go. Mads, are you ready for your 7 minutes in heaven?
I am ready, mate.
Excellent. Okay. Welcome back, Mads, from your 7 minutes with Computer Space. For the uninitiated who have never seen the game before, describe what you saw.
So in Computer Space, you are a little spaceship, a little rocket flying around. There's a great sense of inertia there. You need to boost your rocket to gain some speed, and then you can just turn your rocket left and right, and then you can shoot. And there are 2 enemy saucers, really, right? UFOs that you need to shoot down. And it's on a fixed timer. You get 100 seconds when you put in your quarter. And then there's a score for you and a score for the aliens. And they'll be shooting at you as well. So it's kill or be killed. It's most people would probably know Asteroids, the Atari game. This is the forefather to that game.
Yeah, in many, many ways. I mean, it feels very much like it. Yeah, this game, I mean, we said it at the top, this is its 50th anniversary. It's the first commercially available game, comes out before the Odyssey, and yeah, it is the beginning of what will become ultimately Atari. It is the beginning of what will become the industry as a whole, and we said it in the video version of this that's up on our Patreon page for the patrons. But our good friend Ethan Johnson, who does Department of Corrections, just recently wrote a really great article about whether or not Computer Space was a success or not, because many people don't consider it to be the great success, probably because it didn't ignite the entire industry. but in many ways it gives legitimacy to the arcade, which the arcade did not have at this point. So it's a super, super important game to cover and to talk about, and we will talk about it in the time jump as well.
Yeah, it was a great game. Actually, I played it once before, maybe 8-9 years ago in Berlin. But spending a bit more time with it here, getting to know the controls, it's actually a really, really playable game. I mean, for a 50-year-old computer game, this was it was a joy to play. It was great.
Yeah. I mean, it really has some depth, especially with the inertia effects and really figuring out the timing. And you could also manipulate the missiles a little bit.
Yes, and that's a really, really fun mechanic. So whenever you shoot, if you don't touch your directional controls when you shoot, it'll just shoot straight out. But if you turn your ship towards the right, the bullet, the projectile will do the same. So you can actually control it quite precisely.
And I mean, I don't know enough about electrical engineering to figure out how they did that without a processor, but there's got to be some kind of manipulation going on there with the angles and stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, brilliant stuff.
So are you going to include a link in the show notes so people can try it out themselves?
Oh, of course, yes. Obviously, we did not record this on a real machine. No. And like I said, it's not using a processor, so it's not emulated. But I found a really, really good simulation of it. And we will put a link to that in the show notes so everybody can give it a go.
Yeah, good idea.
Excellent. Okay, then we're done with that segment. Before we can turn on the time machine, we have one more stop, and that's to check in with our good friend Ethan for the Department of Correction.
Welcome back, Ethan. So, before you can bitch slap me with everything that I got wrong for our November 1981 jump.
Yeah, now hold on here, Carl. You kept saying throughout all these episodes, you're like, I'm not looking forward to the Department of Correction. This is here for you. This is a service I am giving to you, sir, and you have just broken my cold black heart down into pieces on the floor. I'm not sure I can trust you anymore.
Did I break it or I crush it into a diamond?
Go on.
Oh, come on, Ethan. You know I only make the mistake so we have an excuse to talk every month.
Sure. You can pretend that's true.
I don't know what I'd do without you, dude. I don't.
Continue your talk.
Okay. So, before we get into the mistakes made in November 1981, it's time for...
God bless ye, Mary Peterman. I don't know. That's my attempt at putting some holiday pizzazz inside this, for these are going out in the December episodes, but we are talking about November 1981. The Peter comment today is Peter was wondering how much money TSR was making on those early D&D books. And actually, there's a book that just came out about this by the great D&D scholar, Mr. John Peterson. And he did a blog post specifically about TSR's financials in that period. And you can include that in the show notes.
I will, and you sent it to me. And yes, I have to admit I lost about 2 hours in those numbers. It was really, really good. If you're that kind of a numbers geek. So, yes, that link is in the show notes below.
Beautiful. All right. So first we go back to November 1971. And you got a little confused on the Galaxy game. And actually, people didn't get to hear this. But Carl actually put it in the wrong spot initially. That he was going to do it several months back before this actually happened. But
that's right.
Yeah.
You fixed it. You fixed it before it went out. So, yes.
But the Galaxy game that was originally installed in the Tresidir Union, I think that's the actual way you pronounce it, Tresidir. But either way, people just call it the Union. But the original model that was put there is not the model that still exists today, the two fiberglass model. It was a one cabinet version that was an oak. I'm pretty sure it was oak cabinet.
Oak?
Yes. There's two photos that exist of it. There's one where Bill Pitts and Tuck are working on it, and then there's another one just of the cabinet itself. I don't know exactly what happened to the original cabinet, but it was just one cabinet, and it's no longer around.
Okay. Yeah, I knew the two cabinet came later. I must have misspoken on that one.
And another for 1971, I believe you said the Intel 4004 was $50, but actually I looked up a actual contemporary listing of it, and it was $30.
Ah, okay. No, I found a listing for 50, and I can't remember what it was. One of the show notes, but 30 would also sound correct.
And that would still have been way too expensive for an individual part in a mass market electronic component, especially considering the Intel 4004 was not very good. It could run a calculator. That's what it was made for. And it could do basically nothing else.
Okay.
Yeah.
So not really what you'd call your all-purpose computer yet.
Yeah, I mean, it had an arbitrary instruction set and all that stuff, but it just, the reason that the microprocessor thing doesn't take off until 75 is because the Intel 4004 couldn't do much at all.
Gotcha. But you have to start someplace.
Indeed. And, you know, they grow out from there, Z80, 8080, and 6502, all wonderful, wonderful additions to our technological world.
Amen.
And now 1981. You were talking about the Game Time wristwatches, and you said they were designed by Mr. J. Smith III, head of Smith Engineering / Western Technologies. But Mr. J. Smith did not originally design the Game Time himself. I believe he does take credit for designing the Microvision. He does not for the Vectrex. People also put that on him, but I don't believe he designed the Game Time.
Okay. So it's just probably somebody either in his company or his company bought the design from somebody else.
It was within the company because his company was a technology company. They didn't do anything about manufacturing. They were making products to pitch to larger companies, and they would do the manufacturing.
Gotcha. Okay.
And next up, another thing about D&D. This was not a correction, but just an interesting little side note. The Dungeon game, which I'm sure a lot of people have played because it's actually a pretty popular board game. Dungeon was developed somewhat in tandem with D&D. They were both coming from the same source. The Blackmore setting by Arneson. Dave Arneson, he had another guy in his group named Dave McGarry, and Dave McGarry was developing Dungeon at the same time that Gary Gygax was developing D&D. And yes, so the relations between them are in a way sort of coincidental if there's something very specific, but they were based on the same general source. And Dungeon, he did try to get it published by TSR, but they couldn't really publish a board game, so he went to another company, and I think then eventually TSR did buy it back. But yes, Dungeon and D&D are related in a very interesting way.
Interesting. And I know Dungeon originally comes out earlier than 81, but it gets this ad push in 81, so that buying back probably, I mean, speculatively speaking, but probably was the reason why the push comes later.
Yeah, TSR went on kind of a buying spree in 81. They bought a lot of different games. It's coming to a blank right now because this is less my area of expertise. But yes, indeed, TSR was trying to become a bigger company, so they just bought a bunch of stuff.
Cool. That usually works out for the publisher, if not for the company being purchased.
Well, usually, I think it was normally just the product, not the company.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So TSR was a small house, and this is something that the John Peterson book does also go into. Like, I'm not even sure they got to 200 people, like, in this big early period. It was a small operation. I've talked to a couple people who worked there. Just because they happen to go into the game industry, too. I'm like, okay. Like, all right. Yeah, very interesting relationships there. But let us move on from that. Next up, you were wondering if there were any other developers of Atari VCS games that were out at this time in November of 1981, and you speculated that Magic might have had something out, but they did not. Magic does not hit its first products until 1982.
Okay, yeah. I couldn't find anything saying that whether or not they made Christmas, and I just thought, well, I'm sure they were trying to, but yeah. Okay, so they missed the Christmas of 81.
Well, it might have been better for them to not have tried to rush it to Christmas because the CES, where the buyers are, was in January.
Good point.
So, they did have existing retail connections because Bill Grubb, got those from Atari. But, I do not believe that they do it in December 81 either. It takes I think they pretty much launch in January.
Cool.
And next up, time for the confusing mess that is Bally Manufacturing. Bally Manufacturing. You said that something about Bally still being around in regards to slot machines and whatnot. No, Bally is not still anything. The Bally company is dead. It is gone.
Oh, even the fitness centers?
Well, the fitness centers spun off as their own company.
Okay.
And I can't remember if they still use the name Bally. I know there's one around here. But I don't know if they still or if they just rebranded Fitness Center or something. Whatever it is, that's not Bally anymore. It started under Bally, but that does not mean it is Bally itself.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I couldn't. For some reason, I had in the back of my head that they were still around, but okay, it makes sense that they're gone.
Yes, and also a company that is gone, Midway. And this is something that has become more and more frequent as of late. And I shake my head at people's ignorance on this. So, Bally Midway is a label. It is not a new company. Bally Midway is just something they started putting on their games. Bally and Midway were already together. Bally bought Midway in 1969, so they were always together. So when you see a Bally machine and a Midway machine, they are the same company. It's just in 81 they decided, because video games were bigger and they'd always published their video games through Midway, they were going to always use the Bally Midway label so they could just get the cred and smush it together.
Gotcha. Double down on that cred.
And then
it's just confusing as hell, but
yes,
okay.
But so I get really miffed when people try and say that this is a different company or new companies. Yeah, nothing. So leave that at that. And then on the subject of companies that do still exist, you were wondering if W.H. Smith still existed. And yes, it does. It is still a retailer in the UK, probably not nearly as prominent, but I don't live there, so I can't tell.
Gotcha.
And finally, on the issue of electronic games, you said that it relaunched in the 90s, but that's not necessarily true. Pretty sure it's not published by the same people. It does have a lot of the old electronic game staff working on it, but very specifically told to Kate Willert, who was very interested in early history of games journalism. She has the whole video about it. She was talking to Arnie Katz, and he very directly told her that the relaunch, the quote-unquote relaunch of electronic games and the original publication of electronic games are not contiguous. They are not the same.
Oh, okay.
And apparently it was called Electronic Games by coincidence, basically.
Interesting, because isn't the logo almost the same? Or it had a very similar looking font. I mean, not identical, but very similar feeling font.
Yeah, I forget the whole story behind this, but at least according to him, as one of the original editors of Electronic Games, he does not consider it to be the same magazine.
Gotcha. Okay, and hey, I'm not going to argue with Arnie Katz. He's the OG game journalist, or one of them.
Yeah, along with Kunkel and Worley.
Yeah.
So, that shall be it for the Department of Corrections. Do you feel your spirit invigorated, Mr. Carl?
And if by invigorated you mean crushed, demoralized, and destroyed, yes, very much so. Good job.
Wonderful. All right, we'll see you next time for November of 1991.
Thank you, as always, Ethan, for your service.
Boing.
So, yes. Carl, you were off by $20 and a full decade this time.
Yeah, $20 and a decade. Yeah. I mean, that and $1.50 will buy you a cup of coffee. No. Yeah, no. A few minor things. I mean, it was a long laundry list of things, but it was a few minor things. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm screwed up that bad this time.
Nah. I'll forgive you. And maybe Ethan will as well, with time.
Oh, yeah. He's a very sensitive man who puts on his kid gloves with me. No, sorry. Yeah, no, all good. Okay, then, with that out of the way, let's turn on the time machine, and our first jump is not going to be to 1981, and it won't even be to 1971. We're going all the way back to 1941.
So is this the first 80-year jump you've ever done?
No, we've done a couple stories in the 40s, especially around pinball, and because pinball at this point isn't the pinball game we know. Flippers haven't been invented yet. So it's really just a game of chance. It's almost more akin to pachinko, but again, that's also a weird comparison to make. But we have an interesting story this time, and no, we don't have a sound effect for 41. And I should also warn, because I didn't do it this beforehand, we're always using publication dates on magazines and newspapers, so obviously the stories happened at some point before that. It's a framing device, people. That's that. And also remember, all the links to everything we're talking about are in the show notes, and you can also support us on Patreon and follow us on Twitter and all that good stuff. Okay, so let's look at the first story from December of 1941.
War curtails Coinop. Sorry.
Yes, the U.S. federal government has ordered the makers of coin-operated gambling machines to cease production as of February 1st to help the supply of war materials. Jukebox makers were ordered to reduce their output by 75% by the same date.
So what were they set to produce then? Are we talking bullets and casings, or...
Bullets, casings, ships, whatever. Okay. Now, what kind of contracts these factories got differed dramatically from case to case, but the main issue was that metal and wood should not be going into these devices.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and like we've said on previous episodes, pinball at this point doesn't have flippers. It is a game of chance. But it has been getting more and more complex with flashing lights and sounds and buzzers and stuff like this. So it's eating up a lot of wiring and so forth. So it's getting more complex, even though it's still a game of chance.
Yeah. But no, now they won't be producing that for a few years, I guess.
Yeah. It's going to basically... and I'm probably off a little bit on this. There will still be some machines out there. The manufacturers of these things are going to be refurbishing a lot of older machines. So they're not officially making new ones, but, they're repainting and fixing up old ones and still putting them out there because they are still very popular amusements. But and especially after the war, there's going to be a ton of these things going out to army bases all over the world. And that's when we're going to start getting into Sega, because Sega was service games. It was games distributed to servicemen in Japan. Started by an American. So we're all of that is coming, and the industry will survive this. It's just kind of interesting that they actually put out an order to turn it to stop it all. Yeah. Okay, now, with that covered, let's jump forward 30 years to December of 1971. And again, I have no sound effect. So, what's our story?
So the first story, the attentive listener will already have guessed what the first story has to be then. Notting shows off computer space at MOA show.
Now, mea culpa here, as I did not check the November issues of Cashbox, the music trade magazine, last month, because that is where the original first notice of this came up. And I only realized I made that mistake because I was listening to another podcast, the Gaming History Hour, and Alex Smith of They Create Worlds was on there as a guest talking about it, and he mentioned it, and I was kicking myself for not checking that. So this should have been in last month's jump, but there's also the December issue of Cashbox where they also do a proper write-up. It is not just a little blurb. about the MOA show. They do a proper write-up on the machine in the December issue, so I'm going to go with that.
Yeah.
And so in their coin-operated section, there's a small write-up of Nutting Associates showing at the MOA show of its new novelty game, Computer Space. Nolan Bushnell was presenting and explaining the device to attendees. So there's a bunch of interesting anecdotes and stories about this. I'll include a link to Alex's episode on this. And it's basically they're showing it off. They don't necessarily get a ton of orders right at the show. And apparently a lot of people were very skeptical and didn't quite understand it. Other people were worried that vandals would try to steal the TVs out of the devices, but it will take off. And a funny little side note, as I was reading about the MOA show, the president of the MOA at the time, the Music Operators Association, was one Johnny Trucano, father of friend of the show, Jim Trucano, who we interviewed several months ago. So it's kind of cool, that his dad was the head of the association at the time the first video game debuts.
Yeah, and something else for your listeners, if they don't already know, I think you mentioned it briefly just before, that the Computer Space is actually based on a 61, 62 PDP-1 computer game that was called Space War. So this wasn't a new game that they made. They just made it available in the arcade so people could play it, because it was only on those mini computers, the PDP-1, that it was available before.
Yes and no. The PDP-1 game is a 2-player game.
Yeah.
And it also has the added feature that there's this sun, this star in the middle of the screen that has a gravitational pull. So you can actually slingshot around it and stuff. So, and those were things that were originally part of Nolan Bushnell's design, what he wanted to have in the cabinet. And unfortunately, those are all elements that they had to take out.
Yes.
Because there was no way to do them in hardware, at least not with the budget constraints that they had to work with. So, Computer Space is an extremely pared down version of the idea, but it is coming from this. It is coming from this world of the stuff that's happening on mainframe computers and mini computers where people are playing these games, but it's limited to the computer scientists.
Yeah, exactly. I'd actually like to try the Space War version you talk about, where you have this gravity well of a star to maneuver around. That would be good fun. The inertia was good already in this simple version I just played. So
there are emulators for that. You can actually play that on an emulator. Yeah, definitely. We can definitely look into that, because it is something that is freaking awesome. I can't remember. Did I play an emulated version of that or a port? I can't remember anymore. But there are emulations of that out there.
Well, not to worry, you just have to invite me on next year in April, because this was, I just found out it's released April 1962, so we can just do a jump there and play Space War.
I'll have to check and see. I may actually wait until there are a couple of reports of it.
Okay.
So the first time it gets a write-up is probably where we're going to talk about it. Yeah. Yeah, and we've talked about the other arcade game based around it, and I believe it's called Space War as well. And now I can't remember, but we just talked about it a few months ago.
Yeah.
And that's at a student union at Stanford. And unfortunately, though, that never goes into large-scale production because it's actually using a mini computer.
Yeah, that'll be quite expensive.
Oh, yeah, extremely expensive. Okay.
Yep.
We're done with 71. Let's turn on the time machine and head over to December of 1981. And here we do have a sound effect.
Rapidly becoming an international craze. 1981.
This is only the first step in newspapers by computer.
Right in the midst of it, thank you.
Welcome to December of 1981. Mads, what's our first story?
Court dismisses counterclaims in Chuck E. Cheese case.
The lawsuit brought by Nolan Bushnell's Pizza Time Theater versus Brock Hotel Corporation over their rescinded contract to franchise 200 Pizza Time Theater operations can move forward after the court threw out counterclaims brought by Brock, which runs Topeka Inn, which claimed abuse of process and unfair competition. Topeka runs the Showbiz Pizza Place chain, which also gets a big write-up in this month's Play Meter.
So what is it with you and Chuck E. Cheese? You always talk about Chuck E. Cheese. What's is that a special place for you, or?
Oh, dude. Okay, and I know as a European you can't quite understand because there's never, I believe, an equivalent here. But
I probably wouldn't know what Chuck E. Cheese is at all if it wasn't for you, mate.
Really? Dude.
I don't think I've heard anybody else talk about it.
Okay, have you ever heard of Five Nights at Freddy's?
Oh, yeah, the game that my kids sometimes play, the scary one.
Yeah, that is a parody of Chuck E. Cheese.
Okay.
So the idea with Chuck E. Cheese was, and again, this is one of those weird things where if you're in the U.S., one of the big things you always want to do is go to an amusement park, Disneyland or something like that. But for most of the people in the United States, there's no real amusement parks of that caliber. No theme parks, I should say. Amusement park is a different thing. A theme park, anywhere near you. So, like when I was a kid, we went once to Disneyland for a weekend, but we only went there for one day because the travel time back and forth to California was forever. Yeah. So the closest you could get was a Chuck E. Cheese. And so you come into this restaurant and you've got a pretty big arcade. So you're probably talking 30, 40 cabinets. You've got a ball pit, you've got skee ball, and then you have a couple of small rooms, each with their own animatronic robot with themes, where you can throw in a quarter and they'll play a song. Like there's one where it's, a lion dressed like Elvis with the rhinestone outfit, and you throw it in and it'll do covers of Elvis songs. Another one's a ballerina hippo or something. And then there's the big room there. They have once an hour this entire musical show with like 12 different animatronic robots telling jokes and singing songs and all this stuff.
So I can see why they base a horror game off of this, because it sounds like the stuff of nightmares.
When you're a little kid in the 80s, it is the most amazing thing in the world. But the problem is, of course, when these things run down and you imagine, what does the animatronic look like underneath that fake fur and stuff? Obviously, it becomes the perfect scenario for a horror game. Or just recently, there was a Nicolas Cage horror movie that's basically Five Nights at Freddy's, the movie.
Okay.
But without the license. He's this drifter comes to this town and they're sacrificing drifters to this haunted former pizza amusement park. But Chuck E. Cheese, I mean, it's like an institution, and they're still around today, but in a very different format. So the animatronics are gone, but there's still pizza parlor arcades for kids.
Okay.
And the idea here was that Bushnell, the concept gets started while he's still at Atari. And he takes it over after he leaves Atari, and they were supposed to franchise it out. And Brock Hotel, and we've talked about this a few times on the show before, but they were going to franchise the Chuck E. Cheese idea. Then they decided to go there on their own and created basically the same exact thing.
Yeah.
They brought in their own guy to make their own animatronics, which apparently were better, but I never went to a Showbiz Pizza, but apparently their animatronics were better. And it was the same exact concept, a bunch of singing, dancing robots, pizza, and video games.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what this whole counterclaim was about then, but it's been dismissed now.
Well, no, what's been dismissed were the counterclaims. So Brock tried to sue, saying that Chuck E. Cheese Pizza Time Theater was basically just impeding their ability to do business. That it was anti-competitive, blah blah blah. And the court said, no. They may have a legitimate claim here, and it's going to go forward.
Okay.
And ultimately, I can't remember. I don't believe it actually comes to a court finding of guilt, but it's a settlement. Basically, at the end of the day, Chuck E. Cheese is going to get a huge amount of money from Showbiz.
Okay.
But due to some mismanagement and the crash and everything else, Chuck E. Cheese is going to end up going to get bought out by Showbiz several years from now. Yeah. And Showbiz is just going to rename all of its operations Chuck E. Cheese.
Okay.
So there's Chuck E. Cheese today, but it's actually Showbiz.
Yeah.
That bought Chuck E. Cheese, even though Chuck E. Cheese was the first one and is going to win. It's a weird thing here.
But enough about Chuck E. Cheese. We have other pieces of news we need to cover here.
Oh, yeah. But I got to throw this in because there were a couple write-ups in the magazines this month about both restaurant chains. Number one, the suit was for $150 million, so we're not talking chump change. And this is 1981, $150 million.
So is that the suit from Chuck E. Cheese towards Brock Corporation?
Yes.
Or
they're suing them for $150 million.
Okay.
Yeah. And the second bit, which I thought was really awesome, was from InfoWorld magazine, which is a computer trade magazine. And they actually talk about Pizza Time Theater in there. And they mentioned that the robots were running off of 6502s, which I just thought was really freaking cool.
Yeah.
So thought I'd throw that in there. Okay. Yes. Sorry. Next story. We've got tons.
Yes. Coinop asks, recession? What recession?
A common theme in many articles in this month's trade publications is the dichotomy between the boom in the Coinop business and the dithering economy as a whole. Will this be sustainable? Will the massive increase in machines being produced lead to a leveling off of profits? Or is the generally upbeat outlook of the quote-unquote coin man really what is keeping the industry ahead of the nation?
So Coinops were doing really well in the middle of a recession.
Oh, tremendously. And this is actually a pattern we've seen in the past. So during the Great Depression, pinball takes off.
Yeah.
And it's one of those, it's a relatively cheap amusement. And we just went through the big inflation period of the 70s. And so that 25-cent play is still relatively cheap. And it's getting cheaper as inflation goes up.
Of course.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the entire economy is falling into recession. Some people are even talking about depression at this point because Reaganomics is not making things better as people had hoped. And but the video game industry is still going gangbusters.
Yeah. Yeah, well, people need to have something to do that's fun, and if it's not that expensive, then of course that'll be where they put what little money they do have.
Exactly. And also the fact is that there's still so much innovation happening and so much excitement, and you have the birth or the real expansion right in this period of time of the family-friendly arcade and the shopping mall, the Chuck E. Cheese's. So there's more and more places where you can go to play games that are not seedy and aren't restricted to taverns.
Yeah. And of course, the early 80s, everything was just so exciting. You can now control stuff directly on the TV screen, and it moves at a breakneck pace these years. So, yeah, of course, it will be interesting.
Yeah, but also in these articles, there are also warning already, what happens when there's so much product out there. At some point, the amount of machines on the market is going to bump up against the reality that there's only so many quarters.
Yeah, sure.
And this kind of leads into our next article.
Playmeter looks back at the year that was.
With the year coming to an end, the numbers are coming in, and many promising titles, such as Star Castle and Berserk, that started strong have faded into the background, while games some looked at with skepticism, like Pacman and Defender, have become the undisputed moneymakers, and some games that seemed destined for greatness, such as Battlezone, have become utter duds.
Some great games there, eh?
Oh, yeah. I mean, these are all stone cold classics today. But, I mean, Battlezone, an absolute dud in the market at the time.
Okay.
And what's crystallizing here is that a lot of games, or better said, very few games have legs. Most of the games are really, really hot for maybe a month or two and then disappear if they're hot at all.
So what you can looking at this list of games, what Pacman and the Defender has that the others may not have as much of is that they are really, really easy to pick up and play, but very tough to master and become really good at.
I don't know if I would say that, because Pac-Man is easy to pick up and play. Defender, have you ever looked at a Defender cabinet?
I've never played the real cabinet, no.
Oh, it's extremely complex because, I mean, the joystick is just left and right.
Mm-hmm.
And also up and down, I think up and down as well. But then you've got your thrust. Then you've got the button to switch back and forth if you're going left or right, because it's not just a one-way scroll. Then you have the entire mechanic of having to catch the humans before they fall after you shoot the aliens that are picking them up, and the radar and all this stuff.
That's true.
And this was the thing, and they even say this in the article, at the AMOA show, there were people worried that Defender was too complicated. Nobody's ever going to bother learning that much strategy. And Pac-Man was considered too easy. There were no buttons. It was just moving the guy around the maze.
Yeah.
And what I think, and we've talked about this briefly on a previous episode, what's starting to happen is that these two machines are successful in very different locations. So Defender is an arcade game. It is big in the arcades where the kids are spending hours and hours so they have time to perfect the games. Pac-Man is huge in bars where women can play it as well, and in locations where the more casual gamer plays. And we're starting to see this breaking up of find the right location for the right game, as opposed to all games play in all locations.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. And it's also very similar to what we were just talking about with computer space, where if you put that cabinet in a dusty bar next to the pool tables, it's not going to succeed, because that design doesn't fit with the aesthetic. The gameplay is too complex. But if you put it in an arcade where people are hanging out for 2 hours straight playing games and they're looking for the challenge, suddenly it can go gangbusters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Next piece of news.
Yes.
Atari numbers continue to soar.
Warner has reported that the Consumer Electronics and Toys division, which is mainly Atari, saw revenues increase for the quarter from July to September by 139% and operating income increase by 350%.
So what would operating income be? Would that be what the Coinop operators make by having the machines there? I mean, actually people putting in quarters?
No, this is consumer electronics. This is the VCS.
Ah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, this is the VCS now.
Okay.
And the reason I'm putting it in here is that, I mean, we still have a little bit of to talk about concerning arcades. And sorry, I didn't color code it this time. But but this is just showing us how big the VCS is getting. And I mean, operating income is how much revenue this thing is generating, just from the operations of the company, from licensing and bringing and selling goods.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's doing really well.
Oh, the profit margins on this are just soaring, and it's so fast and so much, it's not going to be sustainable.
Okay.
And that's going to be a problem. But we'll talk about that when we get to the crash.
Yeah. But in more Atari news, Atari licenses game from Namco.
Oh, yes. An unidentified game has been licensed by Atari from Namco for North American distribution. This is the first game Atari has licensed. The two companies have long ties going back to 1973, and Atari also has home rights to Namco titles Pacman and Galaxian. The two companies have also pledged to deepen their relationship by exchanging both technical and marketing ideas.
Okay, so do we know which game it was?
There's two possible contenders here, Pole Position and Dig Dug. And I'm not quite sure which one they're talking about. Now, Dig Dug hits the market first.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they're not talking about Pole Position at this point.
Okay.
Just because Pole Position is a much larger game, much bigger cabinet and so forth. So it's possible that Dig Dug just makes it to market first, but it's hard to tell. But the fact that they're Namco, which has been selling its games to other publishers, I mean, Pacman ended up at Bally Midway. This is now a very important convergence of both the arcade cabinet and the home rights ending up at Atari.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so Atari sues Online Systems.
Online Systems has been sued by Atari over their Pac-Man clones Gobbler and Jawbreaker. A preliminary injunction was granted that would prevent the sale of either title. Gobbler was no longer on the market, but Jawbreaker still is, and the case will now go to court.
Yeah, I mean, these kinds of suits could be done all the time back then because everybody had their own version of Pac-Man or Space Invaders or, well...
Yeah, and this case is going to become extremely important because Online Systems is actually going to win this one.
Okay.
There's a very famous quote from Ken Williams at the end of it once he wins, where he says, well, I still believe that our game, everything was up and up on ours, but it would be terrible if this decision allowed other people to copy my software.
Yes.
Yeah. And I touched on this topic briefly with him when I interviewed him a few months back. But yeah, so these cases, there's a ton of these cases that Atari's bringing right now. And because, the Atari 2600 port of Pac-Man hasn't come out yet. That won't come out, I believe, until January or February, until early 82. And the wonderfully well-remembered Atari 2600 Pac-Man game, which, yeah. Have you played that?
Yes.
It's bad.
Yes, it's really bad. Just go for the arcade version.
Yeah, exactly. Well, or even Jawbreaker's better, but yeah. It's going to be one of those. But this is the start of a historically very important case in the history of video game jurisprudence. So this is going to start a chain reaction. It's not going to stand as good law for long, but it is going to set the tone for battles to come afterwards.
Okay. Yeah. So in related news, Atari fails to stop Casey Munchkin.
In related news, all right, Atari's attempts to get a preliminary injunction against Magnavox's Casey Munchkin has failed. The case will go forward with a ruling coming down in May.
So that Casey Munchkin was on the Odyssey?
Yes, the Odyssey 2, not the original Odyssey. Okay. And we're going to be talking about the Odyssey 2 here in a second. But yeah, so this was a Pac-Man-esque game, but it actually added a bunch of extra features. So the maze was smaller but had moving walls.
Okay.
And the ghost behavior was also quite cool. It also wasn't filled with dots, just had select dots in different places, but still had, the power pellet and things like that. So it's very much a ripoff of it. But they will lose this case. In May, they will be forced to take it off the market. But at least the preliminary injunction is going to allow the game to sell through the holidays.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a great video about the history of this done by the gaming historian, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. I highly recommend it. I actually use it when I teach legal English in my unit on intellectual property. So it's very cool how the decision came down.
Okay.
But we'll talk more about it next year when that decision finally ends.
Yeah, sure. But speaking of the Odyssey 2, it gets reviewed now.
Oh, yes. Creative Computing reviews Magnavox's follow-up to the original home console, the Odyssey 2. It does not fare well with the flimsy joysticks, processor apparently unable to deal with negative numbers, and games that are at best poor knockoffs of existing titles or run so poorly on the limited hardware that they seem pointless. Similar views are expressed in the UK's Your Computer magazine this month as they do a rundown of the current consoles, including the Intellivision, Atari VCS, and Interton VC4000.
I've never heard of the Interton VC4000. But
I know, that actually ended up being more important and more interesting than the Odyssey. Apparently, it's there's a whole bunch of different consoles from different manufacturers using identical hardware. And this was just the UK version of it. And I couldn't find a lot of detail. I didn't do a deep dive on it. But yeah, it's basically nothing to write home about. It's very weak. Almost, as far as I can tell, it's sort of Channel F level tech.
Okay. But the Odyssey 2, when was that supposed to be released then? If you get the review
the Odyssey 2 is out on the market at this point. So it's released at some point in 81. Have you ever used an Odyssey 2?
No, I haven't.
Okay, a buddy of mine had one when I was a teenager. He had inherited it from some family members. It has these super flimsy. You remember those old IBM joysticks?
Yeah.
Where it was this big block with this tiny little metal stick in the middle. That's kind of what the joystick felt like.
Okay.
It's utterly uncontrollable. And the graphics are very, very sparse. Now, late in the system's life, it will get some pretty cool titles. Casey Munchkin and its follow-up are both really well-programmed games, but the resolution is really low, and it has this keyboard built into it that's, just a flat surface keyboard.
Yeah, okay.
And it was meant, it's sort of a hybrid between home computer and console, because remember, that's still a thing at this point where everybody's consoles are a passing fad. Home computers are coming. That's why Intellivision was going to get an add-on and stuff. And yeah, it's too weak to do anything. And the system's one big killer app at this point wasn't being promoted as Casey Munchkin. I don't think they wanted too much emphasis on Casey Munchkin because of the possibilities of lawsuits from Atari. But it was a game that we mentioned a few months ago from CES called The Quest for the Rings, which was a video game and board game hybrid. And they reviewed that in Creative Computing, and it does not get a good grade.
So how does that work? You need to be in the same room with the board game set up, and you can control some of the stuff on the computer or the console here?
Well, the idea, as far as they explained it, is that you're moving around, and it's very loosely based on Lord of the Rings. So you have 4 different archetypes of heroes with different abilities. And you're moving around this map, and you're trying to find 5 rings that are being held by these, let's call them ring wraiths, because that's what they are.
Yeah.
And when you land on certain parts of the board, then you activate an action sequence, and then you choose that action sequence from the video game, and then it becomes this little maze game where you're running around the maze trying to get to the ring wraith.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound fantastic.
No. And they say it basically doesn't work, and the graphics are so blocky that nothing really looks like anything. And yeah.
Okay.
But
let's jump to the next piece of news then. Tomy cuts deal with Midway to produce handheld games.
Last month, we talked about Coleco's deal with Midway to make their tabletop electronic ports of arcade games, and this month, Tomy Corporation has announced that they, too, have cut a deal with Midway to make handheld electronic versions of Pacman. This is in addition to the already released Pacman 2 from Entex, which is being marketed under a limited license.
So it's a regular Pac-Mania here right now, isn't it? Pac-Man everywhere, or Pac-Man clones.
Pac-Man is an unstoppable phenomenon already at this point, and it's only going to get worse. The Pac-Man cartoon hasn't come out yet. Miss Pac-Man's coming out in 82.
Yeah.
There is no end in sight just yet.
No.
But yeah, so this is going to be the third electronic version of Pac-Man that's actually licensed.
Okay.
And there's other versions that are unlicensed out there already.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I've actually had a few of those Tomy handhelds at some point, but I gave them all away. So.
Oh, how could you?
Oh.
How could you just give them away?
Been using them as prizes in the gaming club for.
Ah, that's pretty cool, actually. Yeah, you are a good man. I would not have done that.
Okay, so next piece of news is that Coleco sees drop in electronic toys.
Coleco is feeling the pinch from a glut of electronic sports games hitting the market at reduced prices as many who entered the field are liquidating their inventories. While they still see growth in their learning toys and, quote, family action and arcade games, end quote, the hit to their core sports game is undeniable, and they will not hit the same record-breaking results they had the prior year.
So are we thinking that this market is lost to the computers and consoles now?
Very much so. I mean, what you're getting here is it was relatively cheap to get into, and a lot of people jumped in. And unfortunately, once you get to a certain saturation point, there aren't enough dollars out there for these products. There isn't enough new innovation happening in these products. And these are not cheap at this point. They're not, the throwaways that we're going to see 10 years later from Tiger Electronics and stuff, and from Acclaim. Instead, these are still games that, for the most part, cost as much as a 2600 cartridge or more.
Yeah, and then it's an easy choice. I can understand why people would go for the VCS instead.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So now for some exciting news here. Captain Kirk pimps for Commodore.
In what may be the first ad of its kind, Captain Kirk himself, William Shatner, appears on the back cover of this month's Compute magazine and Personal Computer magazines, holding a Commodore 4016 and telling you to compare it against the Apple II and IBM.
So I remember some of these commercials with William Shatner from when I was a kid. It was always the VIC-20 commercials I recall, the pictures of him holding the VIC-20. But this was you say it's a 4016. What's that? Is that a PET or?
It's a variation on the PET.
Yeah. Okay.
And here they're targeting the business, consumer. And this is why it's the first one that I've noticed of these ads. But yeah, I believe right around the same time, he's also doing the VIC-20 ads. And it's interesting to compare because in this one, he's wearing a suit. Yeah. And in the VIC ads, he's much more casual.
Yes.
In his appearance. But obviously, you don't do the business ads on TV, but the VIC ones are definitely targeting a very specific demographic.
Yeah, the VIC ones were going for kids as well. I remember back in those days, I would read the Donald Duck comics that were in Denmark as well. They would sometimes have little commercials in them. That I remember seeing it there, I'm sure.
Oh, really? That's awesome. They were using Shatner for the ads in Europe as well. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Oh, cool. Okay, I'm going to have to find a link to that and put it in the show notes because, I don't recall him. I don't recall those ads as a kid. Now, granted, I would have been about 5 or 6 at the time, and I was a huge Trekkie. But I don't recall seeing him. But I don't think he was still doing the promotion by the time the C64 shows up.
Wasn't he? Maybe he wasn't.
No, yeah.
I might be remembering this wrong as well. I would only have been 5 years as well. So, I just feel certain I've seen that. But
I'll look it up. I mean, it's very possible that they were still able to use the license later in Europe than they were in the U.S.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's one of those things where it's just such a coup to get him in there. And there is an anecdote, and I believe it was from Trammell, one of Trammell's sons. And I'll have to look and see if I can find it again. But he said that when Shatner showed up to do the ads, they had this, a Star Trek uniform ready for him and stuff. He's like, I can't wear that. My contract doesn't allow me to. My contract with Paramount. And then they showed him the computer, and it was the first time he actually, according to Trammell's son, was the first time he actually touched a real computer. But yeah, I mean, it's a huge coup because it's come on, it's Captain Kirk.
Yeah, of course, that was a huge thing.
Yeah. But speaking of ads for electronic devices.
Yes. Atari cries foul over Intellivision ads.
The infamous Intellivision Plimpton ads have been causing a stir at Atari. Ray Kassar has claimed that the ads are deceptive and has complained to the three big networks about them, claiming that NBC and ABC have removed them. Mattel countered by saying that Atari had been running equally deceptive ads and ABC ran the ads as agreed through December 6th. CBS was still running them at the time of this notice, which was on December 14th, 1981 in the New York Times. And NBC had only requested that they be altered.
So altered in what way? Because these commercials, I just had a look at them before we started recording here. They are quite on the nose, aren't they? I mean, they are literally somebody saying, well, look at this baseball game and look at that atrocity over there on the Atari VCS. And again, look at this football variation and look at that piece of dump you've got over there on the Atari VCS.
And what's not readily appreciable nowadays is the role Plimpton plays in this, because he was a personality at the time.
Yeah.
He was this sophisticated guy, but he was also famous not only for, writing these in-depth articles about politics and stuff, but he was also a huge sports fan.
Okay.
And he was well known as being a sports fan. So, it wasn't the beer drinking, guzzling sports fan, but he was super excited, but he would say it, with this sophisticated air of education. And so having him talk about the sports games, which is what the first ad really emphasizes, or exclusively emphasizes, that meant something to people watching those commercials at the time. And for everybody who's listening who hasn't seen these, there's links to them in the show notes. One link is just a whole bunch of ads, and I put the timestamps next to it so you can see which ads go where. But it starts off with Plimpton doing a comparison of, I believe, 3 different Atari and Intellivision sports games: football, basketball, and baseball. And, there's obviously night and day between the systems. Then Atari responds with this snot-nosed looking kid who's doing a Plimpton impersonation, talking about, well, I wanted to see what Intellivision's asteroids look like, but they didn't have asteroids. And then I wanted to see their missile command, but they didn't have missile command. And then there's another Plimpton ad where he has a lookalike of the kid from the Atari ad, and he's showing him space games on the Intellivision.
Yes.
And he's like, and the kid's like, I didn't know. And then the last ad that we're linking to, it actually takes it to the next step because it's a Commodore ad, and I'm not quite sure when this came out, if it was early 82 or it was still in 81, where it's an impersonator of the Atari kid and an impersonator of Plimpton, and they're arguing over which one's better. And then there's this cheap beam-in effect, and it's William Shatner, and he's going to introduce them to his friend Vic, which is a full-blown computer that also plays great games. Mm-hmm. And they're like, I didn't know. It's brilliant marketing. Absolutely awesome.
Yeah. It's funny. It feels so strange to me that you could have a commercial like this where you show off your competitors and well, kind of badmouth them, don't you? To just say, see how bad they are. This is a lot better. It's not something we'd see here. Not back in those days, at least.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, and Michael Katz, that we interviewed him 2 years ago, and he wasn't responsible for it directly, even though he signed off on it. But he was at Coleco at the time that they started doing this.
Yeah.
Because they were the ones who compared Mattel electronic football with Coleco's electronic football.
Yeah.
And have you seen those ads?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it's brilliant because you got these two guys and they're in suits, and the suit is basically just a giant replica of the electronic game.
Okay.
And they're both standing on a football pitch, and they're talking about their features. And Mattel Electronics football is just like, you do what? And you do what? I don't do those. And that's where this started. And television is from Mattel. Mattel is basically saying, hey, if somebody else could do it to us, we're doing it to you.
Yeah. It just feels crazy to me. I mean, you see plenty of commercials saying we are the best on the market, but this is very on the nose. This is pointing at the others and saying, look at this, we are better.
Yeah, I mean, and you can't really blame them. Because, I mean, the Intellivision is a whole different class of machine. It's using a 16-bit processor. And it's, it can actually do sprites properly. I mean, the Atari 2600, the VCS can do sprites, but very, very limited,
Yeah, so the listeners should definitely check out the commercials because it's right what Plimpton is saying. I mean, you look at the baseball game from Intellivision, it looks like baseball players running around on a field. And if you look at the Atari one, you need to guess what is actually being depicted there, right?
Yeah. Oh, and the football one is even worse. I mean, the only way they can get the 3 football players that are there on one line is if they're interlacing them, it's just I mean, it's amazing that they got it to run at all, but these are not strong titles.
No. But enough about that. Next piece of news is that Creative Computing reviews the IBM PC.
Yes, we've talked on past episodes about magazines reviewing IBM's entry into the microcomputer market, but the review in Creative Computing magazine highlights a couple of issues which are of particular note. First, they talk about how the graphics adapter has its own memory, unencumbering the memory allocated for programs, as well as the fact that the $40 edition of DOS is an affordable alternative to CP/M.
So at this point in time, in 81, that would be the IBM DOS already, or did they buy a DOS version?
Now, if you bought it with the machine, it was called PC DOS.
Yes.
But it's just a rebranded version of MS-DOS. And Microsoft is selling MS-DOS as well. So it's the same exact program. It's just one of them says PC DOS when you boot it up. The other one says MS-DOS when you boot it up.
I remember the PC DOS versions. I never knew it was actually just a rebranded MS-DOS.
Yeah. They're licensing it from Microsoft. And there's a couple of different reasons for this. One of the speculations is because IBM, at the time of launching the PC, is still being investigated for monopolistic practices by the U.S. government, that they insist that Microsoft not make it exclusive.
Okay.
That they can sell it because they're afraid that if they have an exclusive license on the operating system, that will count against them in this antitrust lawsuit.
Yeah, okay.
And Microsoft is more than happy to sell MS-DOS separately as well.
Yeah.
And CP/M, which is also available for the IBM PC, costs, I think it's 3 or 4 times as much. And they talk about how DOS has basically all the same functions as CP/M. It's a great alternative and it's cheap. Yeah. And this whole idea of having separate memory just for the graphics is unheard of on a computer at this point.
Yeah.
And it's going to be the thing that makes gaming PCs as we know them today possible. It's what separates this out from the Amigas and the Atari STs of the world. It is the big decision, the big change that is really going to make this the ultimate gaming platform.
Today we have 11 gigabytes of RAM on our GPUs.
Yeah, you gotta love it. You really have to love it.
So let's go over to the UK for a while here. Sinclair strikes back at government backing for the BBC Micro.
We reported last month that the BBC Micro got backing from the UK government in the form of a 50% subsidy for the machine's purchase by secondary schools. Clive Sinclair has struck back now with a special low-price scheme for the sale of ZX81 machines to secondary schools. The deal has been accepted by more than 2,300 schools.
So I'd say the UK government did the right thing by backing the BBC Micro over the ZX81.
Oh, definitely. Come on. The ZX81, it's an interesting little hobbyist device.
Yeah.
But I mean, come on. If you have to press down on that weird flat keyboard and every time you press the button, the screen goes black because it doesn't have enough memory to process both the screen and the input, you're going to end up with an epileptic seizure before anything else happens.
And the BBCMicros, that's a great machine.
It is a great machine. I mean, it's using
completely different price as well.
Well, yes, of course, but it has a real keyboard. It's using a 6502. It's got a decent amount of memory. I believe, what was it, 64K was the base version? Or 48.
I can't remember, actually.
I can't remember, if it was 48 or 64. Whereas the ZX81 is running, I believe, off of... I know the ZX80 had like 1K of RAM. I don't know if the 81 upped that in the base version or not, but it's not even a comparable battle.
No.
And this is why, I mean, Sinclair is pissed off about it, but guess what? It's too bad.
Yeah. So, Christmas season, not as bad as feared.
On December 24th, the New York Times is reporting initial responses from retailers to the Christmas shopping season. Revenues were up over last year, but the buying season seemed to have moved back closer to Christmas than usual, with deep discounts cutting into profits. In the world of games, one retailer, Hess from Allentown, Pennsylvania, reported that their best sellers included the Atari VCS that they were selling at cost, and there was, quote, some unusual action, end quote, regarding Commodore computers.
So that must be the VIC-20.
That's the VIC-20.
Okay.
And this is going to be the unexpected shift.
Yep.
Number one, they're selling them through mass retail, which is new. And number two, they're basically priced, as William Shatner told us in the commercial, they're reasonably priced. I mean, at $299, it's competitive with the Intellivision. And it's not that far off. I mean, it's about twice the price of the VCS, I believe, at this time. I'm probably off a little bit there, but it's when you consider that you're getting the full keyboard and that they're selling it as a quote-unquote computer, even though it's only got 5K of RAM and it's going to be almost nightmarish to program on without a memory expansion. It still is. And, I mean, you're going to have to buy a tape drive and your software is going to be on cartridge and blah, blah, blah. But software for consoles is also on cartridge. So... yeah, this thing is going to be selling like hotcakes. We're going to be breaking down the numbers in the next couple of months from the Christmas season. But the fact that this quote was in there, some unusual action, I thought, okay, this definitely deserved a mention.
But Atari wants a piece of that computer action as well, as they slash the price of the 800.
With Christmas behind them, Atari has decided to drop the price of their flagship 800 computer from $1,080 to $899.
So the Atari 800 would be so much better than the VIC-20, specs-wise at least.
Oh, definitely.
But it's a completely different price range, because if I recall correctly, the VIC-20 was launched at $300.
$299.
$299, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, now granted, the 800's been on the market for 2 years at this point.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but the problem is it's $1,000 versus $300.
Yeah, of course.
That's insane.
It's an impressive piece of tech, though. I mean, for its age, I have an Atari 800 here. It's it rivals the C64 when the programmers have done it right. So that's pretty impressive.
Oh, I just recently saw an FPS running on an 800.
Oh.
It was on, I believe, Indie Retro News. It was a story a couple weeks ago. Somebody got it working. It looked brilliant. I mean, it puts stuff like mood on the C64 to shame.
Yeah.
Just because it's got that J minor video chip in it. It is a wonderful piece of kit. The only problem is it was always so damn expensive.
Yeah.
You know? And by the time they bring it down in price, the Commodore 64 is there. And the Commodore 64 has got the SID chip. The Commodore 64 has the relationships with the mass retailers after the VIC. And it will also have the international backing because Commodore is not going to be abandoned by its parent company like Atari will be after the crash.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's hard to compete with the C64 back then.
Yeah, I mean, the C64, while not as technically impressive in many regards as the Atari machine, it has a personality all its own with its different graphic modes and the sprites and everything.
Yeah.
That I think, I mean, when you see a Commodore 64 screenshot, you instantly know it's a Commodore 64 screenshot.
Mm-hmm. And when you listen to that beautiful SID chip, you instantly know it's a Commodore 64 as well.
Especially if you have one of the original ones, old school before the C64C.
Yes.
That nice full-bodied sound. I mean, and then you get a nice Rob Hubbard tune on it, like the loading the title screen for Skate or Die, and you know that you're in a different world. Now I really wish I could boot up a real C64 and do.
I've got 3 right here, mate. You can just I can boot one up for you.
I may actually have to close out the episode with that just for shits and giggles. We're a few years early, but who cares? Okay, I believe we're at the end of our time jump.
We are.
So, Mads.
Yes.
What is the word of the episode?
So the word of this episode has to be Pacman, because we've been covering Pacman handhelds, Pacman clones, and all things Pacman today. So Pacman it is.
Pacman it is. Very good. Very, very good. So, Mads, where can everybody find your amazing work?
They can find me at the Retro Asylum, where I podcast about retro games and all things retro, really. And they can find me at the Playthrough podcast as well, where I play some, more middle-aged games instead. Sometimes even new, maybe only 5 years old. But it's a more long-form podcast. You need to have plenty of time to listen to us waffle in detail about one game at a time.
Very cool. And the cold winter months are the perfect time to jump in.
Oh, yeah.
Excellent. Okay, remember everybody, the links to that are in the show notes. Support us on Patreon here. $1 a month will get you early access to our interview episodes. Leave us a like, subscribe, something, comment would be nice. Come on, people, help me out. And other than that, we'll see you guys back here next time when we jump to December of 1991. We're out.
Bye.